All right, so God is leading me to talk about what it means to be a philosopher. And the path that he led me to get to that question is worth mentioning in and of itself. There are a couple of sticky notes on the board I have next to my desk here, and on them is a sticky note that says, "What did Jesus say the goal of life is?" And with it are two pieces of scripture there, Romans 12 verse 2 and Luke 10 verse 27. And God told me to read those. And that's how I would get my idea. And I read Romans 12, but really was reading Luke 10 verse 27 that stood out to me, because that's a verse that says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And it was that last line, "Love your neighbor as yourself," that really stuck out to me, because I was trying to hear what God was telling me to talk about. It kept being all these different ideas of philosophical answers, I guess you could say. We could talk about authenticity. We could talk about freedom. We could talk about truth. We could talk about anarchy. We could talk about all kinds of philosophical ideas that I have or that I've come to. And I could sit here and make arguments about why this and not that. And that would, in a sense, be fun for me, but it's focusing on those kinds of topics. Loving my neighbor as myself is approaching philosophy in that way. Loving my neighbor as myself, is that what I was really excited about when I was introduced to philosophy. So it got me thinking about, how could I actually help somebody else out philosophically, or how could I encourage them, or how could I distill down the value of philosophy? And then that question came into my head. What does it mean to be a philosopher? Which is actually the title of an article I just wrote. But in a sense, the deeper question is just something like, what's even valuable about philosophy to begin with? Even if you could really solidly define it, what's so valuable about it? And I can't say I necessarily have a very precise answer. In fact, I think one of the most valuable things you could do as a philosopher is not to give very exact answers to anything, to try to write or present your ideas that allows space for other people to think. Now, there's a difficulty with that, because you can end up being too abstract and not connecting to what people actually need, and you don't want to waste people's time. The longer I've gone on in studying and writing philosophy myself, the more and more I recognize that the job of a philosopher is really not to give answers. The job of a philosopher is to get people thinking, to get people seriously thinking about the world around them, to get them to start building their own philosophy of life. And you don't do this by teaching them how to philosophize. That's where the introductions to philosophy are helpful. That's where the philosophy 101 class is helpful. That's where the textbooks on philosophy are helpful. That's where the college courses are helpful. They teach you some of the basic tools of thinking. But the professional philosopher, his job isn't to teach you how to think. The professional philosopher's job is to challenge your thoughts so that you are forced to think. And he mainly does this by making arguments of his own, by directly challenging the assumptions of the people around him and of the thoughts that he's exposed to, and creating a space for mutual conversation, for mutual, I don't really like to call it debate, but mutual conversation and disagreement about the nature of the world, about right and wrong, about who we are and what we should be doing and which direction society is going. The philosopher is fundamentally a challenger, and he can kind of sit in an annoying he can kind of sit in an annoying spot in culture by doing this because it's uncomfortable to have your challenges. It's uncomfortable to have your assumptions be challenged. The classic example of this is Socrates himself, often called the father of philosophy. And as many histories of philosophy will note, he would go around the agora in ancient Athens and ask people questions. Ask people, what is the nature of justice? What is the nature of beauty? What is the nature of truth? And annoy them with these questions, and then they would give him some sort of conventional response, and he would very skillfully question it and almost deceptively engage them in this kind of conversation where they were now forced to think about what these things really meant, to go beyond their assumptions, to go beyond their biases, to go beyond what their society had told them. And that ultimate essence of what Socrates was doing is still, I think, in the most ideal way, what all philosophers ought to be doing. Though hopefully in a less annoying way, hopefully in a more entertaining way, and hopefully in a more open, genuinely open way. There's some debate over whether Socrates was doing that ironically or not, but we hope that a philosopher would be doing that kind of challenging genuinely and with an eye to improve the thought, the way of thinking of the people around him. And so this is philosophy's gift to the world. If you want to call it a gift, it's the thing it's supposed to do. It's the thing that it's the role that it has in society to challenge people's thoughts and assumptions by skillfully questioning these, asserting alternative thoughts and theories to the ones that we are given by the world around us, and to encourage that serious thinking, that deep thought, that foundational thought about the world in individuals. When I look back at when I was first getting interested in philosophy, this is what I valued so much about it, so much about the history I read, so much about the philosophers I read about, so much about the authors and the writers that I was reading, is that they challenged me and they challenged me in really interesting ways. And I had to really think and question my own assumptions, my own biases, my own plans for the future. And that was actually really challenging and uncomfortable at first, which I think it is for most people. I remember when I was 16, one of the things I wanted to do with my life was to go into the military. And it was around that same time where I had made this decision to go into the military that I started getting really interested in philosophy. And I started watching YouTube videos and reading books about it. And this very solid goal I had, this very determined goal I had to go into the military ultimately came under scrutiny. I started questioning it as I had learned to question from the books I was reading and the videos I was watching. And very soon I realized that that wasn't for me, that I didn't really think that was the best use of my time, that I had some moral quandaries, you could say, with the idea of going into the military. And it started to come up against the question, is this the good path? Is this what I want to do with my life? And it's not even necessarily a knock against the military. It was just this experience I had of something that I was so sure about because I hadn't really thought about it. And then when I became interested in philosophy, that interest led me ultimately to question its value, to question its rightness, to question its meaning and its logic to me. And that wasn't the only time. This happened when I was looking at my relationship with my parents. I was looking at my relationship with my girlfriend. I was questioning whether I wanted to go to college or not. And really, it came at the point when I was thinking about who do I want to be and what do I want to do with my life at a time where that tends to be the question that you're asking. But I was lucky enough to encounter and be surrounded by writers and authors and content makers and thinkers who didn't give me answers, but challenged me to think seriously about the answers. They challenged me to think seriously about good and evil, about truth and falsehood, about what it meant to live a good life, and about what it meant to be a part of a good society. And so I would say for me, the most valuable thing I got out of philosophy was really not a bunch of answers. It really wasn't uh, somebody else's transplant of ideas poured into me, though that happened from time to time. The most important thing I got out of philosophy was the encouragement to think seriously and for myself about the world around me and about the most important things in life and the most important concepts in life, and to take that attitude and apply it to the whole of my life. It was the encouragement to be curious, but curious not in a passive way about my life or about who I was, but encouragement to be curious in an active way, in a deliberate way. And that encouragement, especially early on, completely changed the course of my life. It led me down a lot of paths which were totally outside of my imagination when I was growing up, and a lot of paths that were certainly challenging and difficult at times. I think the path of philosophy is not an easy path. It's not always a stable path because, of course, the benefit of assumptions, the benefit of dogma, the benefit of bias is that you have something stable to hold on to. You have something stable that you don't have to second guess. You don't have to doubt about. You can just forge ahead uncritically and thoughtlessly. The downsides to all that is that if you're wrong, which we almost always are, if you're wrong, you can do a lot of harm to yourself and to the world around you. So the path of philosophy can be challenging and unstable. It can be uncomfortable and lead you places where you didn't expect it to lead you. But if you pursue it consistently enough, if you build the skills of thinking critically, keeping in mind all the natural weaknesses of human beings, keeping in mind that every person, whether they're philosophical or not, makes mistakes of thought and has biases that go unchecked. Over time, you build a more rational and I think a more accurate picture of the world, and not just of the world, but of the most essential aspects of those worlds, especially goodness. You see, for me, it was ethics. It was the difference between right and wrong. That was always the most crucial or most, I say, most central and most interesting aspect of philosophy. Because philosophy, of course, is the only rational domain of knowledge that actually addresses the problem of good and evil. And some philosophers, they just say there is no such thing as good and evil, or we can't get an answer of it, it's only subjective. And that's certainly a position you can hold. But regardless of that, philosophy is the only discipline that's capable of providing any kind of answer that's based in reason. And that was super important to me to have as a young man before I became a Christian, because much of my early life was, we'll say, confusing when it came to right and wrong. A lot of the early circumstances gave me a very doubtful picture of right and wrong. And so from an early age, I had to forge that knowledge myself. And I was shocked by the people around me. I was shocked by my teachers and my peers and adults, just adults in general around me, because most of them, they could give you a list of right and wrong, but they couldn't really explain why this particular thing was right or wrong. So it was one of those things that was really interesting and fascinating to me from an early age. It's where I really dove into, and it's still today my most interesting branch of philosophy, even though it's connected to a lot of the other deeper branches, epistemology and metaphysics and whatnot. You can't really answer the question of ethics without answering questions that have to do with the nature of reality and the nature of truth and knowledge. And the ethics can be a little pointless if you don't connect them to questions of a good society. or something that's just beyond your own individual behavior of right and wrong. And so the question, what does it mean to be a philosopher? A very small part of what it means to be a philosopher is to have answers to the big questions. What is right? What is wrong? What is truth? What is knowledge? What is reality? How do we know? What kind of society should we live in? What is beauty? A very small part of being a very small part of being a philosopher is having answers to those questions. But I think any good philosopher is going to tell you that they don't want a bunch of sycophants when it comes to their own thoughts. They want people who are going to think deeply about what they're saying. They want people who are going to challenge them on their own thoughts. And so, while it's a small part of a philosopher's job to have answers to the big questions, it's more essential to his job that his questions challenge people, that his questions make them think, that his questions force them to wonder about life in this deep or fundamental way. That would be sort of the second part, maybe a little bit larger aspect than having the answers. Though I believe that the most essential part of a philosopher, beyond having answers and beyond challenging other people with those answers, the largest and most important aspect of what it means to be a philosopher is to encourage others, to encourage them to think. I think this is the part of many philosophers' lives and writings that can be missing. They're so focused on their own answers. They're so focused with challenging the assumptions of their day, which are both important aspects of what it means to be a philosopher. But they never really take the time to encourage people to thought. They never really take the time to say, challenge me on this, prove me wrong, think for yourselves, and take your thoughts seriously. And not only take your thoughts seriously, but live out your thoughts, which is what it really means to take your thoughts seriously. If you take your thoughts seriously, but you don't live them out, you're just lying to yourself. Taking your thoughts seriously means standing by your convictions, and it means connecting your ideas to the world around you, not just simply sitting around and letting them collect dust in your mind or in notebooks or on your computer, but really trying to live them out and connect them to life, which again, perhaps that just goes back to my own central interest in ethics. In ethics, application is what matters the most. In ethics, action is what matters the most. Politics, which is a branch of ethics, is all about the social applications of ethical principles. It's fascinating. Politics, for example, is fascinating because, of course, everybody has a political opinion, but how many people have seriously thought about the ethical implications of their political opinions? How many people have looked at the ethical premises underneath their political opinions? How many are willing to challenge those ethical premises or to try to justify them by reason? How many are willing to openly and calmly conversate with people about ethical principles? For many people, ethical principles are as incontrovertible and unassailable and unable to be talked about as the idea that existence exists, the idea that we are here or we are conscious. It is one of those realms for many people that they wouldn't even think to really question or to try to justify from a rational perspective. And as a philosopher, our job is to get them thinking about that non-thinking, right? It's to challenge them with their beliefs, and more than challenge them, but encourage them to develop their own philosophy of life. If you simply challenge and destroy and tear down and then try to replace with your own structure, it doesn't work. It just destroys their own intellectual, mental identity, their own intellectual and mental integrity. People need to have their own internal integrity. It's not about tearing people down with your opinions or tearing people down with their answers. It's about challenging them to really think through those things and to build for themselves an understanding of life, of the deep questions. In some ways, I think philosophy has lost that initial spirit. Many academics are stuck in their own institutions, focusing on very minute philosophical problems that are submitted in journals that are read only by other so called professional philosophers, and they've lost the spirit of their profession. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe the spirit of the profession has changed, or maybe the term philosopher has changed. But the real spirit of what it means to be a philosopher is to challenge and to encourage others to understand life at the deepest level, to build for themselves an understanding of life, and to challenge each other to do so and to continue to do so. Because if we're unable to challenge, if we're unable to think for ourselves, if we're unable to build up new and better ideas of the world and new and better ideas on how to live that out, then we're just stuck with the same problems, with the same disasters, with the same bigotry and bias and assumptions. The world needs for philosophers to pick up their traditional role. The world needs philosophers to challenge the thoughts of people in a way that really gets them thinking strongly, deeply, foundationally about their own tightly held beliefs. And I hope that I can do this myself to some degree with this channel, to some degree with my writings on Substack. I don't think you can expect perfection from anybody, and I'm certainly not perfect. But in many ways, my purpose with this channel and my purpose with my writing is not to give people answers. Though I have my own answers, I have my own philosophy of life. My purpose with this channel is to challenge people to think themselves and to encourage them to build up their own philosophy of life and to continue to spread that kind of serious thinking about the most important things in life, because we need it now probably more than we've ever needed it.